Hey there, tonight, we're going to step gently into a part of history that isn't easy, but it's real and important, and worth understanding quietly, patiently, and fully. We're talking about slavery in America, not the big speeches, not the war, just the life, the daily truth of what it meant to live as someone who wasn't free. If this story helps you wind down, feel free to like or subscribe, but only if it brings you calm, and let me know where you're listening from. It's oddly comforting, too. No, there are others drifting off to the same quiet words, so dim the lights, take a deep breath, settle in, let's begin. You wake up before the sun, not because you want to, not because it's peaceful, but because you have no choice. You do not own your time. You do not own your body. You are a slave. Slavery means that you are not free. You cannot decide what you do. You cannot say no. You work, always, and you are not paid, not with money, not with rest, not with thanks. Someone else owns you completely, like a chair, or a shovel, or a horse. In America, this was a reality for millions. Most were taken from Africa, taken from their homes, their families, their land. They were loaded onto ships. The ships were dark, crowded, hot. The air was thick with salt and sickness. Many did not survive the journey, but many did. And when they arrived, they were sold at auctions like tools or cattle. Families were split apart, children pulled from mothers, husbands from wives. No one asked, no one waited, no one cared. You live on a plantation now, a wide stretch of land that isn't yours. The fields are filled with cotton or sugar or tobacco. You work them from morning to night, in the sun, in the heat, through pain, through hunger. Your hands bleed. Your back aches, but you don't stop, because stopping is not allowed. There is a man on a horse, an overseer. He watches. He holds a whip. You know what it sounds like, what it feels like. You have learned to stay quiet, to move fast, to not cry, at least, not where anyone can see it at night. You go back to your cabin, if it can be called that. It's small, made of rough wood. The roof leaks. The walls are thin. The floor is dirt. There are no doors that lock. There is no comfort, just straw on the ground. A blanket, if you're lucky. You live there with others, your family, maybe, or what's left of it. Privacy doesn't exist. Everything is shared space, sleep, sorrow. The air smells of sweat, smoke, and something like damp earth that never dries. Your clothes are rough and worn, not chosen, given, and never new. Your food is simple, cornmeal, salted meat, sometimes not. You are always hungry, never full, but you are not allowed to ask for more. You cannot leave, you cannot run. Or you can. But if you are caught, you are punished, whipped, beaten, branded, or worse. Some try anyway. They follow the stars. They hide during the day. They run at night. Some make it. Many do not. Freedom is an idea that lives far away. It's whispered, dreamed about, sung about, but never guaranteed. You are not allowed to read, not allowed to write. Books are dangerous, they say. Words give ideas, and ideas are not safe for them. So you learn in secret, from others, from stories, from songs. You pass knowledge in whispers, in lullabies, in rhythm. There are small joys, sometimes a shared laugh, a quiet meal, a memory from before, a baby born healthy, a song hummed while working, but they do not erase the weight. They just make it easier to carry for one more day. Slavery is not just a condition. It is a cage with no bars. It's waking up every day knowing you don't own your life. It is watching your child grow and fearing they will be sold. It is kneeling before someone who sees you as less than human. It is being strong because you have no other option and the world. It lets it happen. People write laws to protect it. Churches preach sermons to justify it. Whole systems are built around the labor of people who never asked to be here. Your suffering becomes someone else's wealth. They grow rich while you grow tired. But still, you endure, you survive, you sing, you love, you protect, you teach your children how to hope. Even when hope feels like a dangerous thing, the Civil War will come, and freedom with it on paper, but not yet. For now, the work continues. The fields wait. The sun rises. Your hands reach out again to pick, pull, carry, endure. Slavery is not a single story. It is millions, each one quiet, each one full of pain and strength and stolen time, and yet, but because you refused to disappear. And so, tonight, as you rest, know this: slavery was never just a chapter. It was a world built on cruelty, sustained by silence, and survived by people who held on when everything told them to let go. Tomorrow, the same sun will rise, but so will memory and truth, and the echo of voices that were never meant to be heard. You might wonder how it all began, how a system so large, so cruel, so enduring ever took root in the first place. The answer is not quick, it's not simple, it's slow. Like the way a heavy storm builds on the horizon, quiet at first, then steady, then suddenly everywhere at once. Slavery in America began in the 1600s, but its seed was planted before that, in ideas, in greed, in stories people told themselves about land, labor, and power. European settlers had come to a new land, or, to them, it was new. The people who already lived there would have said otherwise. But to these settlers, the soil seemed endless, rich, ready, waiting. They wanted to grow things, crops like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton, plants that need a lot of care, a lot of time, and above all, a lot of hands. At first, they tried different ways to get those hands. Some brought indentured servants, people who worked for years to pay off a debt. Others tried forcing native people to labor, but many died from disease, or resisted, or escaped into lands they knew better than any settler ever could. So the colonists looked elsewhere, across the ocean, to Africa. There, they found people, not strangers, not wanderers, but farmers, builders, artists, traders, whole families and kingdoms with lives of their own. But the colonists didn't see that, or they didn't want to. They saw workers, or rather, they saw bodies they could turn into workers by force. And so the ships began to sail. They called it trade, but it was theft. Theft of freedom, theft of life, theft of people, men, women, children, taken from their homes, captured by force or trickery, sometimes sold by rival groups, sometimes hunted by European traders themselves. Once captured, they were marched for miles, for days, to the coast. There they waited in dark forts by the sea, crammed into holding pens, branded like animals, numbered like items in a ledger. Then came the ships, the Middle Passage, a name that sounds distant, harmless, but it WASN, single quotes, The journey across the Atlantic was long. Weeks, sometimes months. People were packed below deck, tightly chained together. No room to stand, hardly room to breathe. The air stank of sweat, sickness, and salt. The floor was wet, always wet, with seawater, with waste, with blood. Many died before the ship ever reached land. Those who didn't wished they had, because when they stepped off the ship, they didn't find safety, or freedom, or kindness. They were brought to market and sold, lined up, examined, touched, judged by their teeth, their muscles, their silence. Mothers separated from children, husbands from wives, friends from friends. No one asked their names. They were sold as cargo, given new names, made to forget the old ones, and then they were taken to fields, to plantations, to homes where they did not live, only worked. Asterisk from Virginia to South Carolina, from Georgia to Louisiana, the fields filled with bodies, black bodies, enslaved people, forced to labor from sunrise to nightfall. They planted, they harvested, they cooked, they built, they raised other people's children, they made other people rich, and they were never paid, not in money, not in kindness, not in rest. This was the beginning, the root, a system that would grow deeper and deeper with each passing year. It became law, protected, justified, explained with false science and cruel religion. They said it was natural, that it was God's will, that black people were made to serve. They were wrong. But power rarely listens to truth, so the system continued. It became normal, not to the enslaved, never to them, but to those who benefited from it. It became the way things were. Children were born into it, born into chains. Before they could walk, they were property. Before they could speak, their future had already been decided. The owners passed down land, passed down wealth, and passed down people like heirlooms. And no matter how far those first ships felt, the system still stood, stronger than ever, built into the bones of the country, into its economy, its laws, its culture. Every plantation, every mansion, every bag of sugar or bale of cotton came at a cost, paid in blood, paid in stolen lives, and still the system grew. More ships, more auctions, more laws written to protect it, until one day slavery was not a side note. It was the foundation, and that foundation held up a nation that would one day claim to be built on liberty. But not yet, not then, for now. The work continued. The sun rose, the overseer waited, and the fields, they called again. And so the story of slavery in America began, not with a single event, but with choices, greedy ones, cruel ones, ones made quietly, then repeated, then written into law. The story doesn't end here, not yet. You know now how slavery began. But to understand its cruelty fully, you have to cross the ocean, before the fields, before the auctions, before the long years of labor. There was the journey, the middle passage, a quiet name, an almost gentle sound. But there was nothing gentle about it. It was the route from Africa to America, a sea path carved in sorrow, where people were not passengers, they were cargo. It began in silence, in the middle of the night, in villages deep inland, where people were taken by force, by trickery, by betrayal. Some were kidnapped, others were captured in wars. Some were sold by people they once trusted, and once taken, they were marched. For miles, days, through heat, through jungle, through fear. They walked with ropes around their necks, chains on their wrists. They slept on the ground, ate little, drank less. They did not know where they were going, only that it was away, far away. Eventually, they reached the coast, but not freedom, not rest. There they waited, in dark stone buildings, called slave forts, some by the sea, some built into cliffs, some still standing today. They waited in rooms with no air, no beds, no light, packed in wall to wall, sitting in silence, except for the sounds of coughing, crying, and the sea. Outside, the ships waited, tall, wooden, heavy, their sails folded, like wings that would never bring comfort. The people were loaded like boxers, like grain, like tools, one by one, pushed down into the belly of the ship. This was the start of the Middle Passage. There was no room to stand, barely room to sit. They lay shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, leg to leg, stacked in rows, pressed tight. The space was dark. There were no windows, no lamps, only the smell, sweat, waste, blood, salt, fear. There was hardly air. People coughed until they couldn't, cried until they couldn't, then just lay there, still. They were fed twice a day, sometimes food that was foreign, bitter, spoiled, water that was stale, warm or dirty. Those who refused to eat were forced, mouths pried open, food pushed in. Some were so sick they couldn't move. Others had fevers, vomiting, open wounds, no medicine, no care. People died quietly, sometimes loudly, sometimes alone, sometimes in someone else's arms. And when they died, their bodies were dragged up and thrown into the sea that just dropped into the water. No name, no prayer, no goodbye. And then the ship kept going. Some days, storms shook the ship. The people inside rolled from side to side, thrown against each other, against the wooden walls, bruised, bleeding, praying if they still had strength to pray. Other days, it was calm, the sea quiet, the ship floating under a hot sky. But the stillness didn't feel peaceful. It felt endless. The same boards, the same dark, the same fear. The trip could last 6 weeks, sometimes more. Time didn't make sense. There were no clocks, no sun to track, only the slow drip of suffering, hour after hour, day after day. Sometimes people tried to fight back, a rebellion, a sudden shout, a guard overpowered, a key snatched. But the ships were prepared. Guns, blades, punishment. The rebellion would end, and those who tried would be beaten or killed. As a warning to the others, some jumped into the sea, not to escape, but to end it. They would rather drown than arrive, and many did. Mothers, fathers, children lost to the water, their stories never written, but they mattered. Some survived, some held on to the memory of a home, to the sound of a name, to the voice of a sister, or a child, or a mother's lullaby. One more time, then one more, then another. Until finally, one day, land appeared. Not freedom, just land. The ship docked. The chains rattled again. Bodies were dragged up into the light. Some couldn't walk, they were carried. Others stumbled, squinting against the sun, blinking into a world they didn't know. They had crossed an ocean. But they had not come as travelers. They had come as property, as slaves. The Middle Passage was over, but the pain was not. It had only just begun. They would be sold, branded, renamed, worked, beaten, watched, controlled, for years, for generations. But something had crossed that ocean with them. something the captains and traders could not steal. Memory, songs, rhythms, names, hope, even in silence, even in chains, even in the darkness of the hold, people remembered who they were and passed that memory on. So when we speak of slavery, we do not start in the fields. We start on the water, in the hold of a ship, where people were packed tight but carried something heavy with them, a sorrow, a strength, a history that refused to be erased. The Middle Passage was one of the worst parts of slavery, a sea of suffering, but also of survival, a place where many were lost, but where something sacred held on. And that's why we remember it, because even when the world tried to forget them, they held on and survived. You arrive on land, but you do not rest. There is no welcome, no home waiting for you, no soft bed, no warm food. You are led from the ship to the market. There you are lined up. Strangers walk past you. They look at your arms, your legs, your teeth. They speak as if you are not there. They talk about your price. They do not ask your name. You are sold to someone you do not know, a man who takes you away to a place you have never seen, a plantation, a farm, a house, a place where your real life will never return. You are now a slave. That word becomes your world. You are not allowed to choose where you live or where you work. You are not allowed to leave. You are not allowed to say no. Your time belongs to someone else. Your body belongs to someone else. You wake when they say. You sleep when they allow. Your day begins early, before the sky turns blue, before the birds begin to sing. A voice calls, a bell rings. You rise from your bed, if it can be called a bed. It is a pile of straw, sometimes a blanket, sometimes not. You share your small cabin with others. Too many people for one room. The air is warm from breath, cold from wind, damp from the earth beneath you. You step outside. The ground is rough. Your feet feel the dirt. The sun is not up yet, but your work begins. If you work in the fields, you walk out in a line. You carry your tools, a hoe, a sack, a basket for cotton or sugar or rice. The sun rises, the heat grows. Your clothes are simple, rough cloth, worn stiff. They scratch your skin. You do not have many, sometimes only one set for the whole week, sometimes less. You work all day, no breaks unless they are given. You plant, you dig, you pick, you carry. Your back bends, your arms ache, your hands bleed. If you work slowly, you are punished. If you speak, you are punished. If you look the wrong way, you are punished. The punishment is cruel. A whip, a beating, being tied to a post, being locked away, no food, no rest. You learn to stay quiet, to move quickly, to look down. If you work in the house, it is not much easier. You clean, you cook, you serve meals you never get to eat. You dress the children of your owner. You help them while your own children go hungry. You must smile, speak softly, move without sound. You are always being watched. Even children are made to work. Boys carry water. Girls help in the kitchen. They learn early that their lives are not their own. You are always tired. Your stomach always feels empty. The food is small. Cornmeal, vegetables, scraps of meat. You eat what is left. Sometimes nothing. At night, you return to your cabin. The same cabin, the same dirt floor, the same crowded silence. You rest your body, but your mind cannot rest. You worry about your child, about being sold, about being hurt, about never being free. You try to sleep and hope for strength to wake again. You are not allowed to marry, but you love anyway. You make family from what is around you. You hold hands in the dark. You whisper promises, even if you know they can be broken by someone else's choice. You have children. You raise them as best you can. You teach them to be careful, to listen, to hide their anger, to smile when they want to cry, but still you fear, because they can be taken, sold, gone forever. Without warning, your love has no protection, only risk. Your name is changed. Your language is taken. Your stories are forgotten. But you find ways to remember. You sing. You hum soft songs in the fields. You speak in rhythm. You keep the past alive in your breath. On Sunday, if you are lucky, you rest. You gather with others. You share food. You pray. You try to laugh. You try to feel human. Some learn to read in secret, risking punishment. But knowledge is power, and even small power brings hope. Some run, some try. They leave in the night. They follow the stars. They search for freedom. Some are caught, brought back, punished in front of others. But still some try, because even a small chance is worth everything. And still the sun rises, the bell rings, the work begins again, day after day, week after week, year after year. You endure, because you must. You find joy in small things, a joke, a song, a moment of quiet. You hold on to memory, to your name, even if no one says it, to your story, even if no one listens. This is your life, and though others try to erase it, you carry it still, with strength, with sorrow, with love, with dignity no one can take. Most slaves worked on plantations. These were not small farms, not family gardens. They were massive fields that stretched beyond what the eye could see, land that never seemed to end. The soil in the south was warm, soft, rich, good for growing things, things that made money: cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, crops that needed planting, tending, picking, carrying, drying, packing, shipping, and every part of that work, from the first seed to the last bundle, was done by slaves. The landowners, the planters, they watched, they gave orders, they counted profits. But the slaves, they did the labor. They woke before the sun. The bell rang, the horn sounded, voices shouted. There was no time to stretch, no time to ease into the morning. Work started before light and didn't end until it faded again. In the cotton fields, the days were long and slow. The plants were tall. The thorns were sharp. Your hands would bleed, but you had to keep picking, faster, always faster. The cotton had to be clean. No leaves, no stems, no excuses. You filled your sack, then another, and another. Your back ached, your fingers stung, but the overseer watched, and the whip always waited. In the sugar fields, it was even worse. The cane was tall and thick. It had to be chopped by hand, carried by hand, burned and boiled. The work was hot, heavy, dangerous. In the rice fields, you stood in water, still water, dirty water. You bent all day, planting, weeding, harvesting. The wetness made your feet soft. They cracked, infected, sank into the mud. In the tobacco fields, you worked with care. The leaves were fragile. They bruised easily. You had to move fast, but not too fast. careful hands, quick feet, sharp eyes, and when you left the fields, if you did, the work wasn't done. Some cooked, some cleaned, some sewed, some built, some repaired tools, made barrels, sharpened blades, cut wood, dug ditches. Some were blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, maidservants, stable hands. Even children worked. They fetched water, carried messages, watched babies, cleaned tools. Everyone worked, no matter the age, no matter the health, no matter the weather. In the summer, the heat was suffocating. The sun never seemed to set. Your skin burned, your breath caught, but the work didn't stop. In the winter, the winds came cold. Your clothes were thin. Your shoes, if you had them, were worn through. But the work didn't stop. There were no weekends, no holidays, maybe Sunday, if your master allowed it. And even then, chores still waited. The plantation never slept, and neither did the work. The plantation was not just a farm. It was a system, a machine built on pain. Every part of it depended on control. There were rules, spoken, unspoken, written into law, written into habit. You could not read. You could not leave. You could not say no. You could not say stop. You could not ask why. You needed a pass to go anywhere, even to visit a nearby plantation, even to see your own child if they had been sold away. If you broke a rule, you were punished, whipped, beaten, locked away, chained, humiliated. Some punishments were meant to hurt. Others were meant to scare. All were meant to control the plantation. Owner made money from your body, from your labor, from your sweat, your skill, your time, your years. He became rich. He built a house, a big house, with glass windows, carpets, fine food, servants to serve him, slaves like you, but dressed in different clothes, trained to smile. His family grew up soft. Yours grew up hungry. His children learned to read. Yours learned to bow. He spoke of freedom, of honor, of tradition, while he owned human beings who could not rest without his permission. He wrote letters with the same hands that signed bills of sale for mothers, for babies, for men who once had dreams. And he was not alone. The plantation was common, widespread, powerful. It shaped the economy, shaped the culture, shaped the land. It shaped the people it crushed, and those who learned to look away. And yet, somehow, life continued. You shared food. You whispered stories. You prayed quietly. You sang when you could, in the corners of the plantation where no one looked. You kept your humanity, and still the bell rang, and still the sun rose, and still the cotton waited to be picked, and still you carried your sorrow and your strength into another day, and that day looked just like the one before, and the one after, because the plantation, as big as it was, had only one demand: your work, your silence, your life. And still, you endured, you worked, you obeyed, you kept your head down, because that's what was expected, because that's what kept you safe. But inside, there was something else, a voice, soft at first, then louder, then stronger. It said, no, no to the whip, no to the chain, no to the lie that said this was how life had to be. Slavery tried to take everything, but it couldn't take your mind. It couldn't take your will. And so you resisted, not always in loud ways, not always in fire and fighting, but in quiet acts, small choices, moments of courage, so quiet they might go unnoticed, but they mattered. You broke a tool, just enough so it couldn't be used, just enough to slow the work. It looked like an accident, but it wasn't. You worked slower, not enough to be caught, but enough to feel a little control, enough to say, "This is my body, and I will move it on my terms." You pretended not to understand. You forgot an order. You dropped something. You bent the rules just enough to feel human. Some resisted by helping others, hiding someone who had run, sharing extra food, teaching someone to read, passing a secret message, watching a child who wasn't your own. And sometimes resistance was bigger, bolder. Some ran. They waited for night, watched the stars, listened for silence. Then they moved quietly, quickly, through woods, across rivers, toward the hope of freedom. They followed the North Star, trusted strangers, trusted their own footsteps. Some were caught, brought back, beaten or worse, but some made it. Some reached places where slavery had no law. They left behind everything to find something better. And even when they didn't make it, they tried. That trying meant something. It always did. Others resisted with fire, with weapons, with uprising, with rebellion, sometimes small, sometimes not. In 1739, there was the Stono Rebellion. South Carolina, a group of slaves rose up. They armed themselves. They marched. They fought. They shouted for freedom. They were stopped. Many were killed. The laws grew harsher afterward, but the message was clear. They had not accepted slavery. They had not bowed quietly. In 1831, there was Nat Turner. He believed he had a vision, a sign. He and a group of men moved from house to house. They fought. They resisted. It ended in blood and fear and punishment. But it reminded the world. Slaves were not silent. They were not content. They were waiting, watching, ready. Owners feared resistance. That fear shaped everything. They passed laws. No reading, no gathering, no drums, no traveling without a pass. But still, the resistance found a way. Through words, songs, symbols carved into wood, blankets hung just so, a tune that meant go. Now, a phrase that meant danger. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad. It wasn't underground. It was a path, a network, a lifeline. People helped black and white, former slaves, free men and women. They offered shelter, food, clothing, directions. Each stop was called a station, each helper a conductor, each journey a risk. Harriet Tubman made many of those journeys. She escaped, then came back, again and again and again. She helped others run, guided them through forests, rivers, cold nights. She carried a pistol to protect herself, and sometimes to warn others not to turn back, because going back meant slavery, and she would not let them return to chains. She said she never lost a passenger, and people believed her. Resistance also lived in joy, in memory, in keeping your language alive even when it was forbidden, in singing the old songs with new meanings, spirituals that sounded holy but carried maps, directions, messages, songs that said, "Freedom is coming, keep going, hold on." To resist was to survive, to smile, to speak softly and still be proud, to raise your child with love in a world that gave none, to hope even when hope was dangerous. Resistance lived in your hands as you carved a walking stick with care. It lived in your eyes as you looked up at the stars and imagined something better. It lived in your breath as you told stories about freedom by candlelight, knowing the walls had ears. Slavery was built on violence, but it was also built on the lie that people would accept it. And every time someone ran, every time someone broke a tool, every time someone whispered, "We are not property," that lie cracked. Slaves were strong, not because they were forced to be, but because they chose to be. Every day, in every quiet act of defiance, in every step away from the fields, in every secret plan and sacred memory and silent stare, they did not give up. They did not forget who they were. Even when the world tried to erase them, they resisted. Slavery tried to break you. It tried to make you silent, alone, afraid. But even in the hardest places, even on the hottest days, in the deepest fields, in the darkest cabins, you were never truly alone, because you had each other, family, community, not always by blood, but always by bond. You held on to one another, because no one else would. They said you were property, that you did not feel like others did, that you could not love, or dream, or care. But they were wrong. You loved deeply. You dreamed fiercely. You cared with everything you had, from memory, from dreams passed down mother to daughter, father to son. Stories of animals that talked, heroes who tricked the strong, wise old spirits, kindness that won. The stories taught lessons. They gave hope. They reminded your children you were something more than what the world said you were. You sang songs at work, at night, in the woods, on porches, while rocking babies, while burying the dead. Your voice held power, even when it trembled, even when it whispered. Some songs were sad, some were soft, some were filled with secret meanings, freedom, direction, warning, hope. Music held what couldn't be said out loud, and it helped you remember who you were and where you came from. You created your own celebrations, weddings under trees, births in the middle of the night, quiet moments of joy. Between the long days of labor, even food became memory. Spices and recipes changed by time, but still carrying the taste of old homelands. Meals were shared, brought together from scraps, but made into something warm, something whole, something yours. When someone was sick, you cared for them. When someone was mourning, you sat beside them. When someone laughed, you laughed with them. You watched out for each other, protected each other, helped each other survive. Even strangers could become family. An elder who told stories, a neighbor who shared their cornmeal, a child who held your hand when the overseer passed by. You built a world inside the world that enslaved you. It was quiet, hidden, but real. It could not be owned. It could not be sold. It lived in the way you looked at one another, in the way you said each other's names. Community was safety. It was strength. When someone was punished, you gathered. Afterward, you brought cloth for the wounds, water for the thirst, words to soothe the pain. You could not stop the hurt, but you made sure no one faced it alone. You worshipped together, prayed under trees, spoke to a God who knew suffering, who heard you when no one else did, who promised justice even when the world did not. Your faith was a shelter, not the kind with walls, but the kind that held your soul when your body was too tired to stand. Even when families were broken, new ones were formed. A woman raised children that were not her own. An old man taught boys who had lost their fathers. A girl found sisters in the voices of those who worked beside her. You made kin out of care, out of need, out of love. And that love, it was resistance. 2. Because it said, We are human. We belong to each other. We matter. No law could take that away. You survived together. You hoped together. You remembered together. Even when your names were changed, you spoke your old ones. At night, even when the drums were banned, you clapped your hands and stomped your feet and made music out of rhythm. Even when your language was taken, you built a new one, a mix of sounds, of words, of feeling, a new way to say, we are still here. Your children watched, they listened, they learned, and they carried it forward. Every song, every story, every quiet gesture of kindness. Slavery was meant to destroy, but you built something unbreakable, a family, a community, a memory. You had your family, your community. You held each other up. You whispered hope into the dark. But some hope needed more than whispers. Some hope needed a road. Even if that road was secret, even if that road was dangerous, it was called the Underground Railroad. It was not underground, and it was not a railroad. It was a path, a lifeline, a way out for those brave enough to run and those brave enough to help. It began in the stillness of night, when the fields were quiet, when the house was dark, when the stars looked down like silent watchers. You listened, you waited, you took one step, then another, and suddenly you were running toward something you had never known, but always imagined. Freedom. You left everything behind. The cabin, the tools, the voices you loved, the land you had worked. You left with nothing. Maybe a name, maybe a direction, maybe a song in your head to keep your feet moving. You hid in forests, waded through rivers, walked through cold, walked through pain, walked through fear. But you were not alone, because the Underground Railroad was made of people, strangers, friends, former slaves, free black families, white allies, Quakers, farmers, preachers, mothers, children. They opened their doors. They left signs in windows, a lantern, a quilt, a word spoken carefully. They gave you food, bread, beans, warm water with a little honey, just enough to keep you going. They gave you clothes, a clean shirt, a warm shawl, shoes if you had lost. Yours. They gave you shelter, a barn, a root cellar, a crawl space behind the fireplace, dark but safer than the fields. They didn't ask for thanks. They just said, rest here. You are safe for now. You moved at night. You listened for dogs, for voices, for footsteps on the road. You kept going, sometimes north, sometimes to a port, sometimes to Canada, or even farther. There were conductors, guides who knew the way, who had walked it before, who had escaped, and then returned again and again. Harriet Tubman was one of them. She had run once, alone, afraid, but she made it, and she could have stayed. She could have lived in peace, but she didn't. She came back, again and again and again. She led others through the darkness, through swamps, through forests, past danger, past fear. She carried a pistol to protect, to guide, to say, we will not go back. She never lost a passenger. People called her Moses, not because she parted seas, but because she led people through a different kind of bondage. She was not alone. There were many helpers, some known, most forgotten. They risked their lives. They risked their homes because they believed something bigger than fear. They believed in freedom. Every person who helped, every candle lit, every door opened, every mile walked was part of something sacred. But it was not easy. slave catchers rode through the night. They had dogs, guns, chains. They were paid to find you, to drag you back, to erase your journey. If they caught you, you were beaten, or killed, or sold farther south, farther from hope. If they caught your helpers, they were fined, jailed, threatened, punished. But still, the railroad moved, one by one, step by step, person by person. It was not fast, it was not wide, but it was real, and it worked. Thousands escaped. Thousands tasted freedom. Thousands crossed that invisible line from owned to free. And even those who didn't make it, even those who were caught, they tried. That trying mattered. It was resistance. It was bravery. It was a refusal to be silent, and word spread. Even on plantations, in hushed tones, in songs with secret meaning, in stories told at night, the railroad became more than a path. It became a symbol, a whisper that said, "You are not alone," a promise that said, "There is more than this," a hope that said, "Freedom is possible." It gave courage to those still in chains. It gave fear to those who held the chains, because every person who escaped, every soul who vanished in the night, was one less prophet, one less tool, one more reminder that no system lasts forever. The Underground Railroad was not built with steel, not drawn on any map. It was built with courage, with trust, with the shared dream that people could be more than what others tried to make them. It was not perfect, it was not safe, but it was real, and for many, it was the difference between survival and freedom. Her name was Harriet. You may have heard it before, spoken in classrooms, printed in books, etched in stone. But long before she was a symbol, she was a girl in chains, born into slavery, on a plantation in Maryland. Her name then was Araminta. People called her Minty. She lived like all slaves lived, under orders, without choice, without rest. She worked as a child, too young to carry burdens, but made to carry them anyway. She was beaten, not once, not just, but many times. Once, she was struck in the head, a heavy weight thrown by a man who wasn't even aiming at her. The blow nearly killed her. She fell unconscious, and when she woke, she was never the same. She would fall asleep suddenly, without warning. She saw visions, heard voices. She believed they came from God, guiding her, telling her what to do, and so she listened. Years passed. She worked. She waited. She watched. And then she ran, alone, afraid, with nothing but her faith, her memory of the land, and the stars above. She followed the North Star, walked through woods, crossed rivers, slept in barns, hid in shadows, and somehow she made it. She crossed into Pennsylvania, into freedom. But that wasn't the end of her journey, because Harriet didn't stop. She could have stayed, lived quietly, worked for herself, forgotten the pain, but she remembered. She remembered the ones still in chains, her family, her friends, strangers whose faces she had never seen, but whose lives mirrored her own. So she turned back. She became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but not the kind that waited. She went in, deep into danger, to bring people out. She wore simple clothes, sometimes dressed as a man, sometimes as an old woman, anything to move unnoticed. She carried a pistol to protect, to threaten when she had to remind those she guided there would be no turning back. She knew the paths, the safe houses, the names to trust, the rivers to cross, the hiding places carved into hills. She led group after group, family after family, one trip, then another, then another, each time risking her life, each time risking capture. But she was never caught. She moved like the wind, quick, silent, sure. Slave owners offered rewards, wanted posters with her name, promises of gold. But no one turned her in. Too many. She was a myth, a whisper, a ghost who walked through walls and vanished into the night. But she was real, tired, hungry, human, but filled with something larger, a fire that would not go out. She rescued her brothers, her parents, friends, strangers. She led them through cold, through darkness, through fear, and she never lost a single person, not one. They called her Moses because, like Moses, she led her people from bondage to freedom. But she didn't part seas. She crossed swamps. She walked in silence. She sang soft songs that meant go now, or wait here, or be strong. Her strength was not loud. It was steady. Even after slavery ended, in some places, she kept working, helping the Union. During the war, spying, nursing the wounded, leading raids, saving more people. And when the war was done, she still didn't stop. She raised money, built a home for the elderly, cared for those with no one else. She lived simply. She gave everything away. She never asked for fame. She only asked for justice. When people spoke of her, they used the word brave. But even that seemed too small. She was more than brave. She was unstoppable. Her feet were tired, her body worn, but her spirit untouched. She walked toward danger again and again, so others could walk toward life. She died in her 90s, old in years, young in fire, surrounded by those she had helped, loved, saved. They sang around her bed, a soft song, a freedom song, because she had earned her rest, and now her name lives everywhere, on schools, on statues, in books, in stories. But, more than that, it lives in the hearts of all who dream of justice, who risk something to help someone else, who refuse to turn away when the path gets hard, because that was Harriet. Not just a name, but a light, a guide, a hand reaching out in the middle of the night saying, "Come with me. You don't have to stay. We're going now." The country was breaking, the North, the South, two sides pulling away from each other, two sides growing louder, harder, colder, and at the center of it all, slavery. Some said it should stay. Others said it must end, and in 1861 the conflict became war, the Civil War. Battles were fought, fields became graveyards, families were torn in new ways. But the old pain still stood, the pain of chains, of stolen labor, of bodies owned. And then came a man, tall, quiet, careful with his words. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He had been born poor, grown up working, reading by firelight, learning, slowly, but never stopping. He became a lawyer, then a congressman, then, in time, the president. He did not start as a hero. He did not start as a man with all the answers, but he had questions. And he had something else, a belief that slavery was wrong. He saw a nation built on freedom, holding millions in chains. He saw laws written to protect liberty, used to deny it. He saw the contradiction, and it haunted him. Still, he was careful. He spoke slowly, moved slowly, because he knew the country was fragile. He hoped to stop slavery from spreading. He hoped to hold the nation together. But the South, the states that depended on slave labor, they left. They seceded. They formed a new country, the Confederacy, and war followed. He watched young men die. He watched mothers grieve. He walked among the wounded. And all the while, he thought about slavery. He waited. He listened. He wrote. And then, in the middle of the war, he made a choice. In 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a piece of paper, but it carried the weight of history. It said that all slaves in the rebel states were free, not next year, not someday. Now, it did not free everyone. It did not reach every plantation, but it changed everything. It told the world, this war is not just about land. It is about people. It is about right and wrong. It is about slavery. The proclamation gave hope. It gave strength. Slaves heard about it in whispers, in letters, in Union songs carried by soldiers. Some ran toward the sound of gunfire, knowing freedom might be found on the other side. Some waited, watching for blue coats to appear. Over the horizon, and Lincoln, he became something more than a leader. He became a symbol of change, of possibility, of freedom trying to be born. He still faced pressure, anger, criticism. The war raged on, but he stood firm. He said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And he meant it. He met with black leaders. He listened. He asked questions. He learned. He began to believe that America could not survive half slave and half free, and so he worked for something bigger. Not just a proclamation, but a law, a change to the Constitution itself, the 13th Amendment. It would end slavery completely forever. It passed in Congress, narrowly, painfully, but it passed. And in 1865, slavery, as a legal institution, was over. Freedom was written into the law, into the bones of the country, into its future. But Abraham Lincoln did not live to see that future. Just days after the war ended, he was shot in a theater by a man who wanted the old world back. Lincoln died the next morning. He had freed millions, but not himself. The people mourned. Black Americans wept. Some whispered that he was Moses, taken just before the promised land. Others said he was a martyr, a man who gave his life so others could live freely, and still his words remained. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. A nation with liberty and justice for all. He had not been perfect. He had waited too long for some, moved too fast for others. But he had moved. He had chosen. He had tried. And through his effort, the chains were broken, not all at once, not in every heart, but in the law, in the land, in the lives of those who had waited generations for someone to say what they already knew, that no man should own another. But even when the chains were broken, the weight didn't disappear. Freedom had come, but not fully, not easily, not safely. The war was over. The South was defeated. The Confederacy collapsed. The soldiers went home. Some limped. Some didn't come back at all. The fields were quiet, but the echoes of pain still rang. Millions of people were free in name, but not yet in truth. They stepped into the daylight after generations in the dark. No money, no land, no protection, only hope, only courage, only the dream that freedom might mean more than just the absence of chains. They wandered roads that had once been forbidden, looking for family, for work, for safety. Some found loved ones, some found silence, some found sorrow. They built churches, schools, homes made from timber and belief. They taught each other to read, to write, to sign their names for the first time, because a name written by your own hand meant I exist, I matter. I am not property anymore. But the world around them did not change as quickly. The old powers still whispered, still watched, still hated. There were men who had lost their war, but not their anger. And so the laws changed, but the hearts didn't. Not everywhere. Not enough. New systems grew where slavery had fallen. Black codes, sharecropping, chains without iron, walls without bricks, contracts signed with pressure, enforced with fear. Some were told, "You're free, but don't walk here, don't speak here, don't vote, don't hope too loudly." The North had won the war, but the South wrote the rules again. Still, the freed people rose. They built communities. They carved freedom from dry wood and hard ground. They formed their own towns, their own businesses, their own schools. They ran for office, and some won. Men who had once been enslaved stood in government halls, not as property, but as power. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like a new world might grow. But backlash came. Violent, swift, deliberate, white robes, burning crosses, voter tests with no answers, poll taxes with no fairness, night riders who erased progress with fear. It was not slavery, but it was its shadow. And the shadow stretched long. Yet the people did not give up. They taught their children to walk tall, to learn, to read, to remember. They passed down stories like tools, like weapons, like seeds. Stories of Harriet, of Frederick, of those who ran and those who stayed and those who stood. They sang freedom songs in fields that once held chains. They whispered strength through barred windows and broken laws. And when new movements arose, they were ready. Years later, there would be marches, signs, songs, a preacher's voice calling out a dream that still wasn't done. But it started here, in the soil of war, in the ash of slavery, in the breath of people who had every reason to stop and didn't. They moved forward, slowly, deliberately, step by step, because freedom isn't a door, it's a road, and that road is long, but still they walked it. They moved forward, slowly, deliberately, step by step, because freedom isn't a door, it's a road, and that road is long, but still they walked it. And then something changed, not just in hearts, not just in whispers, but in the law. In 1865, the United States passed a promise, not a speech, not a hope, but a sentence carved into the Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. It was called the 13th Amendment, and it changed everything. Not overnight, not perfectly, but truly. With those words, slavery was made illegal everywhere, not just in the South, not just in wartime, not just when the president said so, but always, in every field, every town, every courtroom, every state. Chains were no longer legal. Ownership of human beings was no longer allowed. It had taken war, blood, loss, decades of voices shouting into silence. But now it was written. It was law. It was done. Almost. Because passing a law is not the same as changing a country. The words were clear, but the meaning still had to be lived. Some people celebrated, cried, prayed. They said, "We are finally free," and they were, legally, officially. But others, they resisted. They found new ways to keep the old power, new words, new rules, new systems that echoed the past. Some states passed laws to trap Black Americans in debt, in prison, in poverty. They said, "You're free, but you must work here. You're free, but don't gather. You're free, but don't vote. And that one line in the amendment, except as a punishment for crime, was twisted, used, bent into a weapon. People were arrested for small things, for nothing, for walking too far, for speaking too loud, for trying to live as though they were truly free. Prisons grew, labor returned, chains came back, this time with a different name. So the fight continued in courtrooms, in schools, in newspapers, in songs, but still the 13th Amendment mattered. It drew a line in the dust and said, no more. No more auction blocks, no more bills of sale, no more children torn from arms for profit, no more whips for falling asleep while tired. That part was over. It was a beginning, a foundation, a seed, and from that seed, other changes would grow. The 14th Amendment, the 15th, the fights for citizenship, for votes, for dignity. But it started with the 13th. It said, you are not property. Not because a kind owner said so, not because a war was fought, but because the country said so. Because now the highest law carried your name, your freedom, your humanity, and still people tried to tear it down, to forget it, to walk around it, to pretend it didn't mean what it meant, but it stayed, and it still stands. Sometimes you can almost hear it, like a quiet voice woven into the wind. You are free, you always were, and now they cannot take it back. But freedom, real freedom, is not just the absence of chains. It is the presence of choice, of safety, of belonging. And when slavery ended, those things did not come. The chains were gone, but the weight still there. You were free, but where would you go? You had no land, no money, no roof. You had your name. Sometimes you had your hands. Always. And you had your will, your stubborn, aching, burning will to survive, to live, to build something new. You might walk for miles, looking for family who had been sold away years before. You might carry your child past fields that once broke your body. You might sleep in an abandoned cabin just for the right to call it your own. Many stayed on the same plantations, the same land, working now for pay, but barely. They've called it sharecropping. You worked the field. The landowner took a share, a big share, too big. What was left was barely enough. They said, you are free to work, but not free to leave. Not truly, because debt replaced chains, and poverty replaced the whip. If you wanted to leave, you needed money. If you wanted money, you needed to work. And the only work was here, under the same sun, in the same soil. It was a cruel loop, and many never escaped it. You were free, but watched, free, but warned, free, but told where to stand, how to speak, when to lower your eyes. There were signs, rules, lines you could not cross, and if you did, there were punishments, not from the law, but from the mob, from neighbors who saw your freedom as a threat. There were lynchings, crosses burned in the night, doors broken down, people taken, people disappeared, no trial, no reason, no justice, and yet you kept going. You built schools, even if they were just cabins with dirt floors and chalk made from crushed bone. You taught your children to read, to write, to count, to dream, because you knew that knowledge was a kind of freedom no one could chain again. You built churches, not just for worship, but for safety, for community, for rest. You sang the same songs from the fields, but louder now, not in sorrow, but in strength. You found each other, formed towns, black banks, black newspapers, black doctors, lawyers, carpenters, poets. You wrote your names on doors and deeds. You said, "We are here, we are free, and we are not going back." And even when they burned your towns, when they tore down what you had built, you rebuilt. You carried your stories forward in songs, in sermons, in Sunday shoes, handed down generation to generation. You spoke your truth to anyone who would listen, and to those who wouldn't, you lived it anyway. You survived. Not just the end of slavery, but the hard beginning of freedom. And that survival was not small. It was not quiet. It was everything, because every meal you made, every lesson you taught, every brick you laid was an act of resistance, of joy, of faith. You knew the road was long. You had walked it already, but you walked it still, with heads held higher, feet planted firmer, eyes open, because even if the world did not welcome your freedom, you did, and that made all the difference. The past does not stay buried, not really, not when the ground still holds the footprints, not when the air still echoes the names. You feel it in certain streets, in certain laws, in the silence between certain words. Slavery ended, but its shadow remains, not just in history books, but in lives, in systems, in stories passed down like heirlooms. Today, you walk through cities built with hands that were never paid. You drive on roads that once divided free from enslaved. You pass monuments, some proud, some quiet, some gone, and you wonder, how could such a thing have lasted so long? How could a country that spoke of liberty live with chains for so many? The answer is not easy, but it is important, and that's why we remember. You go to museums, you see the iron collars, the tiny shoes of enslaved children. You read letters written by people who knew they might never be free, but wrote anyway. You stand in front of cabins where whole families lived in one room. You read their names, the few we've saved. You say them softly, because saying a name is a kind of respect, a kind of resurrection. You visit old plantations, but now you look at them differently. Not as mansions, but as monuments to stolen labor. You ask questions your grandparents might not have asked. Who built this? Who suffered here? Whose voice was never heard? You teach your children not just the dates, not just the facts, but the feelings, the fear, the courage, the love that survived even when families were torn apart. You read the books, you listen to the stories, you attend the lectures, even when they are hard, especially then, because the only way to keep history from repeating is to face it, name it, learn it, not with shame, but with purpose. You watch films, you hear songs that were once whispered in fields, now sung out loud, on stages, in classrooms. You walk through memorials where names are carved in stone, not just generals or presidents, but people who resisted by surviving. You hear of Harriet, of Frederick, of Sojourner, of the thousands whose names we will never know, but who lived, who fought, who hoped. You begin to see that slavery is not just a story about what once was, it's a thread in what still is. It shaped the land, the wealth, the rules, the fears, the dreams, and you carry that knowledge like a lantern, lighting what was hidden, so that others may walk forward without stumbling in the dark. You honor the pain, not by reliving it, but by listening to it, by making space for it, by refusing to forget, because forgetting is easy, but remembering, that is work. Holy work, Asterisk, the kind of work that builds bridges, not walls. The kind of work that takes broken stories and weaves them into something whole. You speak their names. You tell their stories. You pass them on in dinner tables and classrooms and bookshelves, in sermons, in poems, in quiet bedtime whispers, because every time we remember, we resist silence. We resist denial. We resist the idea that suffering can be erased. You stand in the present, looking back, and the past, it does not disappear. It does not haunt you. It teaches you. It shows you what people endured, what they survived, what they built, even when the world tried to break them. You remember, so that their lives were not only pain, but purpose. You remember, so that your freedom is not unearned. You remember so that your children can build something better. And when they ask, "Did this really happen?" you nod and say, "Yes," and we are still learning from it. Because remembering slavery is not about staying stuck in the past. It's about holding the past with care so the future can be free. Some people ask, why learn about slavery? Why go back to something so heavy, so hard, so full of pain? And the answer is because it matters. Because it still shapes the ground we walk on. Because the past doesn't vanish just because we look away. We learn about slavery to understand freedom, not as a flag, or a word, or a holiday, but as a fight, as a truth that had to be earned again and again. We learn because there was a time when people were sold, when a mother could be taken, when a child could be bought, when a man could work his whole life and never own his name. And yet they fought, not always with swords, sometimes just with songs, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a single step in the dead of night. But always they resisted. Every person who ran, who taught, who hid someone, who held a family together when the world tried to tear them apart, they became part of a greater story. And that story is not over. It lives in the classrooms where children learn not just dates, but dignity, not just maps, but meaning. It lives in the libraries where old narratives are rewritten to make space for the ones who were left out. Asterisk, it lives in the museums where chains sit in glass cases, silent but not forgotten. It lives in the questions we ask, and in the quiet we allow so others can speak. We learn about slavery because when we understand what was taken, we value what was reclaimed. We learn because it teaches us how far people went just to live as people, how deeply they believed in something better, even when they'd never seen it, even when no one promised it would ever come. We learn because the systems may change, but the struggle for fairness still asks for our attention. We learn because history is not about guilt, it's about responsibility. We did not build the past, but we walk in its dust. We carry its echoes. We inherit its lessons. And with those lessons, we build something better. We learn so we don't repeat. We learn so we can repair. We learn so we can recognize, asterisk, the signs of injustice before they grow too loud to ignore. We learn to honor the ones who did not live to see what they dreamed of, but dreamed anyway. And when we say their names, when we tell their stories, when we remember what they endured and what they dared to imagine, we say to the world, we have not forgotten. We light a candle for those who had only darkness. We pass a torch that was carried through blood and sweat and silence. And in doing so, we write a new story, one where truth is not buried but lifted, One where freedom is not just given, but shared. One where the future is made brighter by the weight of the past, because that is the lesson, not just what was done, but what was overcome. Not just what hurt, but what healed. You learn about slavery. Not to feel shame, but to feel connected, to feel awakened, to feel responsible for what comes next. Because what comes next is up to us. And now, you know it is the end, but not the end of the story, because history keeps walking. And now, so do you.